4.2 Expanding Construction. As a team, you now have a grid full of evidence and at least a few solid claims that can be supported by that evidence. You've also considered some claims that oppose or counter your position and some that support other positions. Now your team is ready to bring together three claims in support of your clearly stated position and to acknowledge and refute an oppositional claim. Stating a position. Academic writing doesn't encourage buried leads. Your bottom line should be placed up front. A position statement should let your audience know where you stand from the start. A strong introduction should let your audience know the outline of the presentation by including the claims that will be offered in support of the position, and your strongest argument should lead. Your position is an answer to the question of whether or not the state of Florida should decrease funding for the University of South Florida, and that precise statement should be included in your introduction and reinforced throughout your paper and presentation. The position statement must be very clear to all audiences and presenters, so erring on the side of a short, simple statement with supplemental material in the introduction is much better than a statement that is long, unclear, tries too hard, or does too much. Your presentation should also include three claims, and you and your team members should be able to describe each in a few words. In our electric vehicle example, even though each claim had three various points of diverse evidence, the claim could be summed up in a few words. The summary of the claims can be included in your position statement. Instead of simply answering the question of whether or not an electric vehicle is a good option by saying that an electric vehicle is a good option, a better statement would be to say that electric vehicles are good options because they save money, are environmentally friendly, and have great options. Finalizing the position statement then requires you to know your three claims and their order so that you can note them briefly. Your refutation can be acknowledged briefly in your introduction, but avoid trying to fit it into the actual position statement. For our electric vehicle example, after our position statement, we could note that despite opponents' suggestion that owners of electric vehicles drive more, responsible and informed owners take advantage of all the benefits that make owning an electric vehicle a great option. Avoid getting into the argument too early by adding caveats to the position statement. As long as owners don't drive too much, an electric vehicle is a good option. For instance, isn't a good position statement. Including an extended aside in your position statement or introduction can weaken the position and confuse your audience, so save those points for your background context and the context used within your explanation of evidence. Remember that the soundness of a position and claim is determined by how well the statement represents what the evidence says and does. Think through the construction of your position, from the position down and from the evidence up. What the evidence actually says and supports needs to match the statement, and the statement should realistically encompass and fairly represent what will be found in the evidence. Merging your work into an outline will help your team consider the overall presentation and decide which claims to use and where. Presentation outline. An outline will be submitted next week along with the annotated bib and group grid as part of the presentation packet. Remember that the best way to build an effective and well-structured outline is to maintain a regular communication between all team members. Use Teams or Google Docs to discuss the outline steps and sections. As you begin to build your outline, it is important to consider the details in the assignment and structure of the presentation as content is being selected and arranged. Group presentation. Your team presentation will support an answer to the following question. Should the state of Florida decrease funding for the University of South Florida? The presentation should include the following elements: title, team members, agenda, position statement, context, three claims and evidence, opposition and refutation, conclusion, and references. At least 4 sources should be integrated in format in accordance with the defined style. At least 2 relevant visuals are required. The presentation should be 5 to 6 minutes, include 10 to 20 slides, and be viewable online asynchronously. Your instructor will clarify expectations for formatting and presentation and provide any additional directions. Consider this basic structure as you think through which claims and evidence will be used and in what order. Intro slide with titles and names. Agenda, table of contents. Position statement. Context, 1 to 3 slides. Claim and evidence, 2 to 3 slides. Claim and evidence, 2 to 3 slides. Claim and evidence, 2 to 3 slides. Opposition and refutation, 1 to 2 slides, summary and restatement, references. In the presentation, the content will be supplemented by sights and sounds that engage the audience and work together to support your position. While all elements of your presentation function visually, at least 2 specific visuals are required. So consider how images, graphs, or charts can work to strengthen your argument. With this layout in mind, your team should select the best claims and evidence to support your position and appeal to all your audiences. Evaluate the claims closely and critically with the awareness that as you are trying to convince your audience, at least some members will hold a conflicting position and will deconstruct your claims and evidence in search of holes and flaws that will allow them to dismiss and refute your position. Cultivating claims. Your team has developed a few claims with supporting evidence, and now you are ready to select the strongest claims and best evidence. One reason it is important to be able to deconstruct and refute opposing arguments is that you can use those techniques to analyze your evidence, claims, and connections to guarantee that they are strong before you present them to your audience. The first step in deconstructing a claim is simply to question the evidence by checking the source to determine its credibility. Sometimes you find that the source is weak or that the quote is out of context and that the article doesn't really say what the presenter said it says. Your own arguments must also pass this test, so you need to check all the claims and evidence your team is planning to use to make sure they are from strong sources, represent the evidence appropriately, and are not exaggerated or taken out of context. If the evidence is sound, the next thing to investigate and question is the connection. Remember our example of support for increasing funding based on President Corral's statement that the money would go to research and development? To start, if we looked at the source, which should be stated in the in-text citation and on the reference page, we wouldn't find it because it doesn't exist. But if we did find the quote in a credible article, and we found that it was precisely stated, we would look closely at the reasoning used to connect the evidence to the claim and consider all the pieces of the claim together. While the evidence does show that the cut in funding resulted in collateral losses, suggestion that the return of that funding would necessarily result in the return of the matching grants, lost jobs, and research results lacks evidence and is based on an assumption. Assumptions mean that the connection between the evidence and the claim is not strong. When we recognize a fault in the logic, it is important not to throw out the whole claim without considering whether the connection can be strengthened. In this case, we could simply soften the statement so that it matches the evidence without overstating the outcome. If we said that the evidence shows that increasing state funding could open up opportunities for outside funding sources that could produce matching funds to offset the state investment and produce added value, we wouldn't need to suggest that prior options would still be available and could instead simply note that our evidence supported prior experience and suggested the continuing possibility. Used in this way and with these terms, our evidence supports the claim. If we wanted to strengthen the overall claim with concrete evidence, we could look at other grant opportunities or interview an administrator in the Office of Research and Development to ask what would be done with the increased funding. Perhaps there's a plan for bigger grants, broader research, and better jobs that you would learn about conducting primary research like this, which makes for strong results and a savvy researcher. That depth of investigation isn't expected for Project 1, but knowing how to get there will benefit you greatly in future courses and careers. Our goal is to think through the construction and deconstruction of arguments in order to connect and disconnect claims and evidence. There are a number of other techniques that can help us consider the connections between the evidence, the claim, and the position. Many techniques build on the approach we employed to find the faulty connection in the claim about USF R&D above, which was simply to disconnect the evidence, the claims, and the connections and look at each closely. What we found was that the connection between the evidence and the claim relied on an assumption. In the previous section, we also learned that exaggerating or overstating evidence weakens the claim. In addition to looking for assumptions, exaggerations, and overstatements, we discussed generalization and extrapolation as errors in reasoning that we should avoid in our construction and use to test the strength of other arguments. Essentially, we are looking for errors in reasoning, problems with the evidence or claim, or other weaknesses in the argument. Locating logical fallacies that demonstrate a weakness in the argument can provide us with language to deconstruct an argument and to discuss specific weaknesses. For example, you might think about the cause and effect between the evidence and the claim to see if you notice a questionable cause. One of the most important connections to look for in arguments you construct and deconstruct is the possibility of a statement that suggests causation when the evidence only demonstrates correlation, often known as correlation without causation. Both the evidence and the claim can be true without there being a cause and effect relationship. For instance, what if someone claimed that the Yankees playing baseball causes it to rain, and the evidence presented in support was that it rained every time the person went to a Yankees spring training game, which was supported with a chart detailing the rain during Yankees spring training games? Well, it could be true that it rained every time the person saw a game, and the rain chart could prove it. What was identified as a correlation, meaning that they occurred together instead of causation, meaning the Yankees caused the rain. Considering alternative explanations and contextualizing the evidence reveals that the Yankees usually play in the afternoon during spring in Tampa, which is the season where it rains nearly every afternoon. The alternative explanation is that the Yankees are scheduled to play at a time when it often rains, and that explanation helps us see the flaw in the causal claim. While you might happen to know that it rains during certain months in Tampa, and you might naturally gravitate towards scrutinizing ideas and analyzing arguments, practicing specific analytic approaches that support this process can make you more effective at analyzing arguments and using what you find to deconstruct an opposing claim or strengthen your own. Causation and correlation are important distinctions in general, and we can see how they function in claims related to research like clinical trials. Recall our flu drug example. What if a patient were given the flu medicine and then died? Would we know that the drug killed him? What if he died in a car crash? Or what if a group of 10 women were given the flu medicine and 6 of them died within a month? Can we say that 60% is high enough to determine correlation or causation? What if we were testing the drug specifically on centenarians and all the women were over 100 years old? Or what if they all had late-stage lung cancer? Once you know what to look for, you will start to notice errors in connections, weak research designs, and flaws in the reasoning of many arguments you encounter, and within your own reasoning, which is the definition and goal of critical thinking. Strength of evidence and clarity of research design is another reason that scholarly publications are considered more credible. Publication standards and peer review scrutinize the data and design, which should also be included in the publication, and the process adheres to regulatory standards. Becoming familiar with a few main fallacies is a helpful way to move critical thinking and argument analysis into your regular practice. Straw man, red herring, ad hominem, slippery slope, hasty generalization, cum hoc ergo propter hoc, and post hoc ergo propter hoc are a few useful fallacies. The contemporary concept of decoupling can also be very useful if you are interested in argumentation and learning new ways to discuss contextualizing an argument to understand the relevant parts and separating them from distracting argumentative devices. The overall process for deconstructing and contextualizing an argument in order to think critically about the pieces separately and together is analysis. Sometimes we just accept information without thinking through it, and sometimes we pause for a minute to let it all roll around in our heads as we question and consider it, but we rarely go to the lengths required to reach analysis. And while it isn't necessary to deconstruct or analyze everything and everyone we encounter, there are instances when we need to comprehend something thoroughly. Reading critically is the first step towards analysis, and analysis is a requirement for evaluation, as we see in Bloom's taxonomy. For our purposes, evaluation would be determining the quality of a claim within the context of our presentation. We know we can't test the efficacy of our presentation by tracking how many members of our imaginary audience we convince or what they do in response to their new informed opinions, but we can think about our imaginary audience, our real audiences, and our assignment, and use that information to evaluate which claims are the strongest and should be included in our presentation and papers. Once you think through the potential claims and evidence your team can present in support of your position, consider how to organize the content to make it as convincing as possible for your audience. Ordering an argument. There are a number of approaches to organizing claims in the strongest order to present the strongest argument for a specific audience. There isn't one simple or single answer because the most effective presentation in support of a position depends on the audience, as we can see through discussions of the rhetorical situation. Your group presentation should arrange the best 3 claims and the strongest refutation in the best order to appeal to all your audiences. In general, it's smart to lead with the strongest claim, but there are occasions when the claims have to follow in order because they build upon each other. Furthermore, the strongest argument can differ according to the audience. A standard approach for considering the construction of arguments is Aristotle's rhetorical appeals, or at least the main ideas of ethos, logos, and pathos. One way to apply these concepts is to make sure that your position is supported by claims and evidence that appeal to each of the three. But the concepts are also useful to think through how to arrange claims effectively by considering which appeal will speak to most members of your audience. If you have one claim that appeals to ethos, credibility, one to logos, reason, and one to pathos, emotion, arranging them in the order of ethos, logos, pathos is likely to be an effective order because establishing the authority of the speaker from the start is important. Logic is usually more concrete than emotional appeals, and closing with an appeal to emotion allows you to determine how you want your audience to feel at the end of the presentation. In practice, however, all three appeals are interconnected and iterative and should be peppered throughout the evidence offered to support each strong claim. Letter for Birmingham Jail by Dr. Martin Luther King is considered a master class in using rhetorical devices to appeal across audiences and is often coded for rhetorical appeals to as an example of their use or to practice rhetorical analysis. Appealing to ethos does not simply mean that the presenters should convince the audience of their credibility as they begin the presentation or even throughout the presentation, because the credibility of each author and source of evidence is also important. Establishing credibility through signal phrases, identifying the speaker, and in-text citations, identifying the source for each piece of evidence, capitalizes upon the rhetorical role of formatting and connects conventions of academic writing and argumentation to the concept of rhetorical appeals. Further, the three appeals rarely function in isolation, so it is important that you have one claim that appeals to ethos, one to logos, and one to pathos. So it is unlikely that you have one claim that appeals to ethos, one to logos, and one to pathos. For instance, is the claim that electric vehicles are a good option because they are environmentally responsible and appeal to reason or emotion or both? And if you use a credible source, does it hit all three then? And doesn't the impact depend on the audience? And are reason and emotion necessarily separate? Simply appealing to the emotions of an audience member doesn't mean that the evidence is devoid of logical appeals. And often even an individual piece of evidence can appeal to more than one. In general, most claims should be supported by multiple sources of evidence, so each claim can include different evidence with varied appeals. Review Letter from Birmingham Jail for an example of how appeals can be used intentionally and effectively. Finally, familiarity with other basic formats ranging from the scientific method, hypothesis, and testing used across disciplines to classical argument format can inform approaches to organizing claims and evidence in support of a position. Applying a critical lens, such as gender, race, class, ability, or age, can illuminate often overlooked perspectives that expose weak spots that weaken an argument. Some presenters and audience members will see these spaces because they inhabit them, but individuals who don't can remember to look. These general techniques are useful across disciplines, and each discipline also complements these basics with specific techniques and tools to analyze text and evaluate concepts. Our goal is to use these approaches to select the three best claims, support them with strong evidence, and arrange them in the order we feel will appeal to our audiences. In addition to three claims, we want to identify a major claim used to oppose our position and refute it. Countering a claim. Addressing and deconstructing the main evidence of other perspectives in a debate can be an effective way to convince somebody who supports another position. If an audience member doesn't know much about the topic, simply becoming informed through your presentation and the claims you offer in support may be enough to earn that audience member's support. But in many cases, audience members are not neutral or disengaged and are firmly convinced of an alternative position. In these cases, offering an alternative explanation that counters the opposition is generally required to shift an existing opinion. If an audience member is convinced of an opposing opinion, it is unlikely that that person has never heard any of the information you're going to share in support of your position. So simply presenting your claims is unlikely to have an impact. Presenting strong claims and solid evidence will establish your credibility and demonstrate your comprehension of the broad content. Countering at least one of the well-known claims in the debate that is probably recognized by and informs the audience members who oppose your position, however, requires them to consider and question the claim and potentially to reconsider the position. For example, they may realize that they didn't have all the information, that there was evidence to counter the evidence that informed their position, or that their position itself was not as strong as they thought. The presentations will allow each group to practice refuting a main opposition and to showcase the skills of deconstruction and countering. Countering a claim in practice can simply be discrediting a claim or evidence. If you find that evidence is not from a credible source, for instance, simply discrediting it by proving that it is unreliable is a strong way to refute a claim. When the evidence and claim are strong, noting a connection that is overstated or that demonstrates any logical fallacy to suggest that the connection is flawed is a valid means of countering a claim based on a weak connection. Recognizing a weakness in an opponent's claims allow you to propose a counterargument, but recognizing a weakness in your own claim allows you to address the weakness. To practice this argumentative tactic, you need to notice weaknesses in your presentation or respond to weaknesses your audience points out to you as they deconstruct your claim. When we realized that we had an assumption in our claim that decreasing funding from USF would result in the loss of more grants and jobs, and that renewing the previously cut funding would result in the return of lost grants and jobs, one response was to shift the strength of our claim, which can be done through choices in language use. Hedging terms such as may, perhaps, appears to some extent, in some cases, possibly, depending, ostensibly, can be used to limit, qualify, or temper a claim. Whether or not you hedge the claim, it is generally useful to avoid absolute language, such as always, all, never, none, positively. Instead, boosters, such as in fact, evidently, conclusive, can demonstrate confidence without overstatement. Locating weaknesses in the connections between evidence and claims allows you to dismiss, discredit, or doubt a claim. But even if the evidence, claim, and connections are strong, adding new information can serve as a counterargument. One way to address strong arguments against our position is to minimize them. Another option is simply to concede the point. In fact, concession can be a strong play in a counter. By acknowledging that one claim against your position is a strong claim, you earn credibility and strengthen your argument by showing that you can acknowledge valid oppositional claims. Then, when you refute another oppositional claim or minimize it or its relevance within the opposition, it might appear more legitimate in light of your willingness to recognize and concede a strong opposition. And you can argue that while one strong point is valid, the weaknesses of the other claims limit the strength of the position overall. A refutation doesn't need to be as elaborate, but more extended assignments may call for a concession and an extended refutation. If we anticipate our opposition and become aware of the major claims that support opposing positions or refute our position, we can prepare a counterclaim by reviewing their evidence and looking for other research to counter the counter. Deconstructing and analyzing claims is an important way to locate weakness that we can point out in other arguments or fix in our arguments. But there are also well-established claims with evidence in support of positions that are put forward by stakeholders on all sides of a topic and from all perspectives in a conversation. When we read for context and when we search for persuasive articles on our topic, we should have encountered strong claims that argued for positions other than ours and in opposition to ours. For our outline supporting electric vehicles, the counter was that electric vehicles resulted in increased driving by owners, which negated the value added through the electric vehicle. Our response to the counter argument was to say that informing buyers could combat that finding, which is a fine counter. Assuming we reviewed the source stating that added mileage and found that it was recent and credible and exhaustive, which is not often the case, leaving many citations open to some form of criticism, we could offer a counter by adding another source with contradictory information to counter the claim, or we could contextualize the oppositional claim by adding more information, which might show that the claims can't be generalized or that even with the extra miles driven, other benefits remain. Perhaps we could find a study that claimed most buyers of electric vehicles were committed to the environmental benefits of the car. Simply pairing that source with our suggestion that given the information, owners would pay more attention to their mileage would strengthen our response. Or perhaps we could find a credible source that looked at a different population of electric vehicle owners and found a different result. Or perhaps we could even locate a study that tested the finding that electric car owners drive more, but couldn't replicate it. Or better yet, found the opposite. Countering a strong source that says one thing with a strong source that complicates the first source shows that there are other sides to an argument and is a fine way to diminish and or dismiss a claim or counterclaim. There are many ways to refute or counter a claim, and they are all built on the same close and critical reading and research skills used to analyze claims and evidence. Thinking through a claim in order to understand it and counter it is also the foundation of research. Remember our example above when we considered the option of interviewing an administrator in research and development to find out more about how a decrease in funding would impact USF? By locating the assumption in our argument and thinking through the counterargument, we came up with a gap in the research and thought of one way to fill it with primary research. For our group presentation and paper, we will only counter one oppositional claim. Many research papers ask that you offer at least 3 claims supporting at least 2 main positions. But because our assignments are an argumentative presentation and a position paper, we will focus on our position statement and on only one main oppositional claim. Listening to the claims from your peers who are supporting another position can also inform your selection and refutation. The opposition you refute can counter one of your team's claims or your overall position, or it can simply be a main claim in support of the other answer to our question. So if our position is that the state should not decrease funding for USF because USF impacts the local economy, incentivizes corporate relocation to Florida, and provides access to advanced medical care, we could identify a source that counters the corporate relocation claim by suggesting that companies really come to Florida because of the tax breaks, not because of the qualified workforce. Our counter could be to point out that while tax breaks are a strong incentive, companies also consider whether or not there's qualified workforce. So without USF to train students to enter skilled positions in Florida, companies couldn't come here for the tax breaks. In this example, we used one of our claims that USF helps to bring companies to Florida to ground the oppositional claim that it is actually tax breaks that bring companies, not the available workforce supported by USF. That is refuted. It takes both to bring companies and good jobs to Florida. Countering an oppositional claim that is tied to one of your claims is a fine option, but make sure your refutation offers new information instead of simply restating the same claim you've already offered. The opposition you refute can also be broad, well-recognized claim in support of the opposing position, which is a strong approach because if you refute a major claim of your opposition, you are weakening their overall argument, which is likely to cause your audience to reconsider the overall strength of your opposition. If you only counter a weak oppositional claim, you are less likely to impact your audience because they will know from the class presentations that the other side has stronger claims, and they will be able to identify your claim as a straw man. If your position is in support of decreasing funding for USF, perhaps you determined in your reading that a main claim being used by those who oppose decreases in funding is that decreasing funding will increase tuition. You can counter that claim with a source that shows increasing funding for public schools does not necessarily decrease tuition, and decreasing funding does not necessarily increase tuition. Perhaps your source shows that a causal relationship between tuition and funding is not supported in the data or on funding and tuition over the last 10 years in Florida. While including a source can strengthen the counter when available, not all counters require a source because they can simply question the existing claim. So even if you don't have the source to problematize the claim that decreasing funding will result in increased tuition, you can look at the claim your opposition uses to suggest that decreasing funding will result in increased tuition and deconstruct the source by showing that it does not support a causal claim. Remember that your audience is current USF students. What claims would be of interest to your audience? Do you think students care about tuition? Do they want amenities like a lazy bull river? Are parking and food on campus things that students see as worth their money? What would make students want to decrease funding to USF? How does comparing the USF budget to the funding for other public schools in Florida impact student opinions? How do these considerations connect to larger questions about the role of higher education, the ethics of access to education, the rights of Floridians, and the responsibility of government? While you do want to appeal to your audience, scare tactics such as claiming that decreasing funding will result in increasing crime on campus because there will be no funding for police may not prove effective on an audience of students who are actively deconstructing the sources used to support such claims. When you have already thought through how to refute a claim as part of the process of deconstructing and analyzing the claim, finding evidence to support your refutation can be guided by a search for key terms and concepts. The supporting documentation that electric vehicle owners would drive away the benefits, we only needed to find a general source that said behavior was impacted by information, not a source that specifically stated that owners of electric vehicles would drive less if informed of the risk. While that specific finding would be an incredibly strong refutation, it's unlikely that the specific research has been conducted and published. Nevertheless, a general source could work fine. Deconstructing an opposing claim is a great way to highlight the critical and creative thinking of your team. Either think through the process together or have each member present the counter offered in 4-1 and discuss which refutation works best in the context of your presentation and why. While it is easy to think that simply selecting the strongest refutation is the easiest option, recognizing that each member's counter can serve as a starting point and can be expanded with input from all team members. Merging and modifying a few of the presented counters might even be possible and productive. Further, the strongest refutation cannot be determined without the context of the overall outline and the broad perspective of the overall argument it creates. Synthesis. For assignment 4.2, your team will collectively select 3 claims and an oppositional claim to refute. Each member will respond to the questions individually and upload separate submissions. The same 3 claims and evidence and the same opposition should be used by all team members, but all the language around the sources should be written by each individual separately and should not overlap. The goal is to practice building the language around the source material that explains and connects the content to the claim. Doing so with your team and using the same source material is a useful way to see a number of different approaches and styles and to clarify that everyone understands the sources that will be presented. Even when the same direct source material for the claims, evidence, and opposition is used, the process of bringing it all together and explaining the reasoning and connections independently will result in different products that will be graded individually. Each team, as a result, will be able to compare and synthesize the presentation based on a variety of samples that share sources but approach interpretation and integration differently. The individual writing that frames the shared sources can be used in the personal packets. Pay attention to the practice of working together and individually, and think about how to manage your own content. That does not mean that you have to keep separate documents to avoid adding too much of your personal content in the documents you share with your team members. But keep in mind that later in the semester, you will have to write a position paper of your own, responding to the same question. Therefore, always try to learn from the content you create now, so that you can use certain ideas or sources in your individual paper as well. As a group, also discuss academic integrity and avoiding plagiarism to make sure you have the practices in place to make sure all sources are being attributed. Because all team members are participating in the group presentation, there is no need to worry about plagiarizing each other, but all source materials need to be cited. When the focus shifts to the position papers, you will want to be sure that you have access to all the work you've done and that all team members are clear on who wrote that. Technically, all the papers could use the same source material, but that's unlikely. Some source overlap is likely though, and that is fine because, like your presentation, direct source material is only a small portion of your paper. The bulk of the content is the explanations you use to clarify the sources, the interpretations you provide for each piece of evidence and its associated claim, the connections you define between source evidence and claims, the integration of each section within the whole, and the transitions you use to connect it all. Source material provides a skeleton, but your thinking builds the body. For now, use shared sources and start to create the language that will wrap around the source material individually. Assignment 4.2. All the team members of a team will use the same sources, but the assignment will be submitted individually. Using shared sources, begin the work of outlining those sources independently by constructing and submitting complete sentences for each of the following. Number 1, position statement. Number 2, 3 major points of background context, formatted in 3 complete sentences. Claim and evidence. Number 3, state the claim and explain how the evidence supports the claim and how the claim supports the position in a paragraph or less using complete sentences. Number 4, claim and evidence. State the claim and explain how the evidence supports the claim and how the claim supports the position in a paragraph or less using complete sentences. Number 5, claim and evidence. State the claim and explain how the evidence supports the claim and how the claim supports the position in a paragraph or less using complete sentences. Number 6, opposition and refutation. State the oppositional claim and refute it with or without source material using complete sentences.